So good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and start today with just a little meditation. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and let go of whatever distractions we might have. And then I'll lead you in a short reflection so we can set our motivation for our time together. So again, I think you are all pretty well versed in meditation, but once more, if you need any guidance in terms of working with the breath, there are a couple of points that they advise working with, and the one that I usually suggest is the sensation around the nostrils, again, where you feel the air coming in and out. But also the point in the lower abdomen is a good point to focus on as well, where we feel the rising and falling of the abdomen as we inhale, as we exhale. That's a subtler point, but something that can be useful if you have a lot of distraction in the mind to bring the mind down to the lower part of the body. But again, if you have another technique that you use with the breath or some other object that you want to meditate on, you're welcome to do that during this time. So we'll do a few minutes of silent meditation, and then I will lead you in a short reflection. We'll begin now. So, at the end of last night's teaching, I mentioned a few thoughts that we could start our day with, and perhaps some of you have already done that when you woke up, the beginning of your day. But let's go ahead and reflect on those. First of all, we have woken up with another day in this human life. Is already something to rejoice in, to feel grateful for. Another day when we have this human mind and intellect that we can use to develop qualities and to remove our negative tendencies, to do the work that Buddhism calls upon us to work with our own minds. So, how wonderful that we have another day in this life. We did not die last night, and we can be grateful for the opportunity that this day presents. And I also suggested that we meditate very briefly, first thing in the morning, on the three remembrances that we spoke of last night, part of the five remembrances. The first one pertaining to aging. And I am in the nature of having to face old age. This is what we are subject to. In other words, it's another thing that is inevitable. If we live that long, then certainly aging will occur at that level. But aging is happening all the time. Our body's continually moving forward in this trajectory into old age. So just reflect briefly on that fact that we are subject to aging. This is part of the nature of existence. And then the second remembrance that we are also subject to illness and the nature of having to experience ill health. This is part of having a human body like ours. Every one of us has had one time or another when we've had to deal with some form of illness. This is the nature of our existence, for the body to lose its vitality to some degree through varieties of illnesses. Just reflect on how this is a part of our existence, something we have to accept and remember. So reflect on that briefly. And then the third remembrance, that we are also subject to death. That our very lives are in the nature of having to die, having this life come to an end, to cease. This is just the nature of existence. Something, again, that is inevitable. We just reflect on that fact briefly to try to gain a greater acceptance of that reality. And then I might add to these three remembrances what I mentioned that Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, which is to hold the thought, I will die today. Today will be my last day. And again, if we can't bring it up at that strength, at least to think about the possibility that death could come. I could die today. It's in the realm of possibility. I don't know what the day holds for me. This is an important thought to hold, to recognize that death is with us all the time. This is, once more, the nature of our existence, not just to be subject to death, but for death to happen at an uncertain time. Can never tell when this will be what we have to face. Again, reflect on that briefly. Try to hold that awareness that this could be our last day. And then from that thought, we can then bring to mind the two things I mentioned last night that are the main concern for this weekend and for our time together. To be compelled, based on accepting death and loss, to use this life wisely, to do what we can while we have this human existence, to accomplish what is beneficial, what is good, what is wholesome. And of course, also to prepare ourselves accordingly for the reality of death, so that when death comes, we will have some measure of peace, not have so much fear, perhaps not have any fear at all, and maybe even again look forward to death based on the great spiritual practitioners of the past that used death in a very profitable way, very meaningful way. So generate those thoughts that we're here together to engage in this course out of desire to use our lives wisely and to be prepared for when death finally comes. And let this be the main motivation for being here, starting from that place. And then also adding on the motivation of wanting to help others to also use their lives wisely, to confront the reality of death, and eventually to be able to help all beings to attain the deathless state, the state of nirvana, peace, to attain eventually the state of Buddhahood, complete enlightenment. And this is how we make our time together very meaningful, quite specifically directed at what we're trying to accomplish this weekend, but within the context of helping ourselves and all beings to actualize our full potential, to become enlightened. Okay, and then you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin today's session. Okay, so good morning again, and I'm curious if anyone had any reflections on working with those teachings this morning. Hopefully you had a chance to wake up to that. Yes, please, Kenan. Ah, good. Great.
Doing, doing that every morning,
Uh-huh.
you know,
That's great.
yeah,
That's great.
yeah. So,
Yeah, so doing the death awareness meditation, I mean, it does take a little while to go through all of the steps. We'll get to that maybe a little bit later today and into tomorrow, perhaps even, but it's a very powerful meditation.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah,
yeah. You've been doing that for a while,
yeah,
working with
yeah,
that?
yeah,
Great,
yeah,
great. Ah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, Lama Zopa Rinpoche would often emphasize that this is really what spurs us on in our practice, right? If we are recognizing that the reality of death and especially the uncertainty of when it could come, and recognizing that what is most important is what we do with our minds. Because again, with that teaching I did last night in terms of mind and introducing this whole idea of mind, which most of you are quite familiar with, what goes forward with our minds into our next lives are all the imprints that we've made in our mind through what we've done. And of course, all the karma, the actions that we've done that are going to inform our experiences going forward. So it's very important to be attentive to what we do with our lives and having a death meditation quite regularly. If we can't do it every day, at least, once a week or so to recall that reality, then it spurs us on to use our lives really purposefully, to do something good with it. So when we end this life, we at least can feel good about what we've done, have no regrets. We can die without regrets. That's wonderful, right? Do you want to say something more?
No, no.
No. Okay. All
I-
right. Okay. Anyone else?
oh,
Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of in the same vein as the third remembrance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I think about it, I remember I've been trying to sort of look at daily activities, and sort of I had been thinking, one day this will be the last time I do, have breakfast or whatever. But sort of on our discussions, in these teachings, I was thinking to expand that to this could be the last time I have breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think I know Lama Zopa likes to bring in kind of a lot of daily activities to
Sure.
be mindful, and
Yeah.
I think sort of looking at yeah, just whatever we're doing in the moment and thinking
Right.
it could be the last time. That's
Yeah.
pretty powerful. So
It is. That's good. It's
yeah.
good advice. Yeah. If we think this could be the last time, we don't know. Again, we like to think we know. We like to think that we've got a long stretch of days ahead of us, and we very well may have. Because again, that tends to be what happens. But like I said last night, one day we're going to be wrong, thinking that we've got all those days. Live every day and at every moment of the day as fully as possible. And then have those thoughts of like, well, this is it. This is the last time that I sit down to do my meditation. If this is the last time I sit down to have breakfast or do whatever, where do I want my mind to be? Do I want my mind to be distracted by the election and all the craziness going on in our world? Or do I want my mind to be focused on positive thoughts, wholesome thoughts? Much more beneficial to die with that type of mind and to at least have our last activities be around that. So again, I think that's the whole gist of it when Rinpoche says this, is he really wants us to be attentive so that we make sure that our day is as complete as possible, so that even when we get to the end of our day, and if we have made it to the end of our day, death hasn't happened yet, well, then we can rejoice that we had a full day of making merit, doing positive things. How wonderful. It's the best use of this life. And we can go to bed happy, rejoicing in all of that. And then get up the next day, hopefully, if we didn't die that night, and do the same thing. And just feel like every day we just do, what's the slogan in AA, right? One day at a time, and I think it should be our slogan in Buddhism, one day at a time as well. We have these goals. Again, in the motivation, I was even suggesting that larger range of trying to become enlightened for the sake of all beings. And that's going to be some time for most of us, maybe be able to accomplish some steps on that pathway to getting to that goal. But it happens every day. Again, that idea of like every bucket, every drop of water you put in the bucket is going to eventually fill the bucket. Every single day that we put some energy into changing our minds and working with our lives in a positive way puts another drop of water in that bucket, keeps moving us towards that goal. We don't have to accomplish filling the whole bucket in one day, but we can do it day by day. So I think these are good thoughts to have. Say this is again, I'm just going to give a little context for those of you who might be new to the Lam Rim. I don't know. The Lam Rim is two Tibetan words, usually called stages of the path. Rim is path, and I'm sorry, Lam is path, Rim is gradual or graded. And the idea is that we have teachings that take us on a very gradual way to attaining enlightenment. And there are some preliminary topics, which of course are recognizing the value of this life that we have and seeing how precious it is that we've been under the influence of these amazing teachers who have brought us these teachings. But the very first topic when you begin the actual stages of the path is death and impermanence. To really get that this is something we're all going to have to face and we don't know when. Yeah. And that's, of course, the kicker on all of this is that that's uncertainty. Many of us will live to a very old age and die at that point sometime in our 80s, 90s, whatever, maybe 70s, I don't know. But a lot of us won't. So again, there's no certainty with regard to that. So it is important that we use this life meaningfully. We're going to see more of this coming up in terms of as I continue working with these 5 remembrances. And then speaking of those, let's go ahead and carry on. If you do have some additional comments or questions, there'll be a chance for that maybe at the end of this little discussion on these. So again, these 3, I'll put them on the screen once more. We have, uh, I'm of the nature to grow old. I'm subject to aging. This is the nature of these bodies. You don't stay youthful and young with a, pliable, energetic body. Things change in that direction. I'm of the nature to have ill health, and this is something we all have to deal with. Again, some worse than others. It's unfortunate people who've had, ill health most of their lives. This happens in human lives, right? But every one of us has had some time in our life where we've had to be in bed for maybe days, dealing with illness, or have problems with our body that are part of an ongoing or chronic illness. So, and the third one, the big one for this course in particular, I'm of the nature to die. Again, all of these are related to just having a human body, though. This is the condition that we have in this human existence, and these remembrances are to get us in touch with that reality. The fourth one is kind of interesting because it's moving us even in the direction of recognizing that, especially at death, though even throughout life, we are having to be separated from the things that we are close to. The way Thich Nhat Hanh words these is this one. He says, "All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them." Either you will die and be separated from the loved ones at that point, or your loved ones will die throughout your life and you have to be separated from them in that way. This does kind of move into that whole territory of grief a little bit. I'm not going to talk that much about grief as part of this weekend. But obviously, I mean, when we prepare ourselves in regard to that fourth remembrance, to remember that it is inevitable that we're going to be separated from everything that we love, everyone that is close to us, then we are preparing ourselves to some degree for that reality. We're not quite as shocked when we hear about people who are close to us dying. But I'm not saying it's going to get rid of your grief necessarily. Grief is a natural response. And we don't talk about grief so much in Buddhism. And I even saw one teaching from somebody who said, well, Buddhas wouldn't grieve over anybody. And maybe that's true. But I think when we look at grief, there's kind of different components to it. One of the components is definitely involved in our sadness, our recognizing suffering, because we see that someone who we loved is no longer in that embodied form, is now, consciousness off to who knows where in Buddhist terms. But essentially, there is a sadness that's occurring there that is just a reaction to the suffering of the world. So, I mean, at that level, it's a healthy response. It's healthy to grieve at losing people in our lives or even situations in our lives, to lose a job or to, have to lose your home, which, happens often in California with fires and floods and everything else that occurs now, right? So again, that can happen to us and we can be a little more prepared for the reality of it, but you're still going to experience some level of grief because it's your response to sadness, to loss. Now, where grief can become a bit more painful is when we have attachment to those things. And that's what hopefully our meditation on this fourth one is going to alleviate to some degree. Attachment is a mind in Buddhism that is essentially looking at something that provides us with pleasure, that is of that nature. It's something might be quite specific in providing pleasure to us. It might not provide pleasure to everyone, but we get attached to that, meaning that we think that it is completely of that nature, of providing only pleasure, and we grasp at it and don't want to be separated from it. We want to continue to experience it. And most of the pain of grieving actually comes, or a good part of the pain of grieving comes from the attachment that we have. Attachment is mostly about me. It's about me not having what I want in my life. And so I get attached to these things and pull them into my life so I'm never going to be separated from them. And when we have to be separated from them, it's like total, disaster because we are used to having that in our lives. We pull that into our lives and get quite attached to it being there. If we have a recognition of impermanence, though, especially when it comes to the people in our lives of death, then we maybe again are not quite so shocked by that reality. But as I said, we still will grieve. There still will be a sadness at not having those beings in our lives. His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about how he grieved when his mother passed away. Yeah. It's like permission to grieve. We don't have to like not grieve because we're Buddhists. We grieve, but we grieve primarily from that sadness of that person having to go through what they went through, whatever suffering they had to experience, to recognizing that we're focused on them. It's not quite as much about us then. We don't get so wrapped up in it. I mean, I'm not trying to toot my own horn here or anything around, thoughts that I've had, but when I lost my mother back in June, I can't say it was the first thought I had, but one of the thoughts I had as I reflected on her death that day was thinking about all of the motherless, fatherless, sisterless, brotherless people in the world, especially in Gaza, Ukraine, and all these places where there's great suffering, right? I mean, just to think about what it's like to be without beings in your life that you depend on, especially when you see these pictures of so many children who have lost their parents and other family members in Gaza and what have you. It doesn't take much to open our our hearts to the reality that this is a universal experience, that being motherless, fatherless, whatever, is not something we have alone. And so it doesn't need to become focused on ourselves and our own attachment to having what we want in our lives. It can become about that more universal pain that we all go through. Again, they might not be something we do immediately upon grieving. And again, I don't know, these thoughts were somewhere in my mind, but I can't say they, something that I focused on always. But I think it does help when we're grieving to recognize that this isn't a unique experience. It's part of the human conditioning. And this fourth remembrance is to help us to do that. Just say, this is the nature of existence, that I'm going to have to be separated from everything that I love, that I feel close to, that I like having in my life. We're going to get into this in some degree when we get to the death awareness meditation, because part of it is working with that idea of having to look at the things that we have in our lives and recognize we're going to be separated from, but moreover, also see how useless all those things are in our lives. Even the people that we have in our lives, I'm not, kind of making it negative about them. They can only do so much. Death is going to be a process that unfolds for us, our experience of it. So again, we'll get to that when we get to the death awareness meditation. But this fourth remembrance, I think, can be very powerful, especially to help us to once more eliminate some of our attachment to these things. And Lama Yeshe, founder of our organization, he would always talk about how, the pleasure itself from having good relationships, good food, friends, whatever, all of this in our lives. I mean, the pleasure itself is not the problem. It's the attachment to the pleasure. In fact, Lama Yeshe used to say that the more pleasure, the better, dear. Like if you have more pleasure in your life, that's not a problem. It's just how are you relating to pleasure in your life? How are you relating to all the good things that you have? That's why there are some people certainly that find it useful to simplify their lives, to not have quite so many possessions, to be, kind of ready to let go of everything because you don't have that much to let go of anymore. But it's okay to have these things in your life. You just have to watch your mind with them so that you don't get that grasping, tight mind that wants to pull them into your life and doesn't want to part from them and gets upset whenever anything happens to them. We have to watch when that happens. So this fourth one is a good one to remind us of, again, particularly at death, we are going to have to separate from everything that we have called mine. That's an extension of our sense of ego and self, is that we hold things to be mine, the possessions that we have, the friends that we have, the body that we have, all of these things. Again, we'll look at this a little bit later, how we need to let that go. So this is an important one of these. The first three, again, pertain to really our human existence in terms of this body, that it ages, that it gets ill, and that it dies. But here it's just our general conditioning. Everything that we have, subject to change. It's not going to stay the same. Have to be separated from all of these things eventually. The last one is quite Buddhist in nature. And those of you who aren't Buddhist, well, you might see this even in terms of other teachings. When I grew up Catholic, I knew that to some degree my afterlife was going to be dictated by what I did with this life. So it's a similar type of concept. And even in the Bible, they say, as you sow, so shall you reap, that we have some consequences of what we've done. But this is quite specifically talking about karma. I inherit the results of my acts of body, speech, and mind. My actions are my continuation. In other words, when we get to that point where death happens and our consciousness goes on to our next existence, this is one specific way that we're talking about this fifth one, I am going to go on to inherit whatever it was in terms of what I karmically created in this life and, of course, in prior lives. That's the sort of energy that keeps us moving from life to life, is what we call our karma. Now, karma, of course, is a term that isn't unique to Buddhism and the Eastern traditions in general. This is a concept that is taught. So it's not something that's, the Buddha came up with. It was an observation on the basis of his omniscient mind about how things actually function, that we have this principle of cause and effect, that we are creating the causes through what we do with our minds mainly, but also, of course, our physical actions through our body, our verbal actions through our speech. All of these create imprints in our minds that ripen into certain experiences. So this is the idea behind karma, is that we are the creators of our own experience. And I go back to when I grew up Catholic. I'm not trying to, again, poke holes in the Catholic faith, but I would ask these sorts of questions at, I think every one Friday every month, Father Mogilnicki, he was the pastor of St. Casimir's in St. Louis, where I went to school. And he would come in to do like a little class with each of us and answer questions. And I'd go like, my question was, Father Mogilnicki, and according to Catholicism, we're all supposed to become Catholic and enter into, the grace of God, so we can become, united with Him in heaven and so on. Like there's a very set scheme about what you're supposed to do with this life. But I said, what about the people who never find Catholicism, like the people in some part of Africa who Catholic Church never reaches them, so they're out of luck. I mean, this doesn't make sense to me. Well, how could you measure people on the same guide if the conditions are different? Somebody's starting off in some part of the world where they don't have these teachings, and I'm starting out in a Catholic family where I get these teachings from birth. Well, he didn't have an answer for that, really. He just said, well, this is a mystery. Only God knows all of this, and blah, 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 and I found that very unsatisfactory. Again, I'm not saying that Catholicism doesn't have any answers to any questions, but that was a burning question for me. I wanted to know why there's differences, why are things not quite so fair in our world, if this is the measure of how using your life meaningfully. Well, again, karma really answers that. Karma says that essentially we all are the products of our own past actions. So when we look at the world and we see injustice or we see poverty or we see whatever it is that we're reacting to, we can understand it from a karmic perspective. But once more, I like to make sure people see that karma is really just that, an explanation. It's not a justification. We're not supposed to say, oh, those people are poor. Well, it must be their karma. Well, they just have to deal with that. It should move you that people have created the causes for their own suffering, just as we have created the causes for our own suffering. That's the principle behind karma. And of course, we create the results of happiness as well. That's part of the karmic equation. I think in the West, we tend to focus mostly on karma being, oh, they'll get theirs because of the bad things that they're doing. But we don't think about karma being the instrument by which we actually have good things in our lives. We have resources in our lives because we've been generous and kind in the past. We have good health because we have protected the lives of others in the past. All of these good results are products of our past actions. All of the negative results are products of our past actions. Everything we experience to a large degree is a product of our past actions. Now, what we do with those results, that's how we create new karma, right? So we have these things that come into our lives that are a ripening of our past karma that could be quite problematic. Well, then we have to learn how to be more skillful around those so we don't keep creating the same karma again and again and again. I'm not going to go into whole teaching on karma. I think Venerable Angie is going to be teaching the karma module of Discovering Buddhism next. So if you're curious about karma, it's called All About Karma, and it gives you a lot more information in terms of working with this. This fifth remembrance is to recall that it is important then that what we do with our lives. It's important what we do with every moment of our lives, because we are creating these seeds, these imprints that will ripen into future experiences. There's that old adage in Buddhism that if you want to know what you did in the past, look at your life now. So if you have good fortune now in your life, rejoice. The being you were with that same mental continuum in another life or even earlier in this life was engaged in really positive things that have resulted in you having the good fortune you have. It's not luck. and we like to think that maybe there's an element of luck involved in it or chance or something. It is actually a creation of your own past actions. If you're dealing with misfortune right now, well, then acknowledge, take responsibility that it must have been things you did that were not so skillful. And take responsibility for trying to, again, work on those, purify those, do the opposite of those going forward. The second part of the adage is, and if you want to know what you're going to experience in the future, well, look at what you're doing with your life now. How much time are we really spending, once more, in Buddhist terms, working with our minds, trying to develop positive qualities, meditating on compassion, loving kindness, meditating on death awareness and the other topics of the Lam Rim to improve our understanding and our use of this life in a meaningful way? Everything that we are going to experience is a product of what we're doing now. Of course, prior to this as well, but they use that kind of measure to say, pay attention to the moment. This is a ripening of our past karma, and what I'm doing it with this is going to create my future experiences. So it makes us very, attentive to what's happening. When I found the teachings on karma, of course, to me, this was like the perfect solution to everything. It's like it explains all of it. It explains why we're all in very different situations. There isn't that kind of baseline of needing some sort of fairness because everyone is a product of their own past actions. Fairness doesn't even really enter it again because that's more about justification and what have you. It's simply beings are at the point that they're at based on their past actions. I have to say that my father, I went to some teachings here in the Bay Area when I lived here. There were teachings at both Land of Medicine Buddha and Vajrapani on karma, this like week-long teachings on karma. And I'd never really had many teachings on karma. And first of all, I have to say that it really is the piece of the puzzle for Buddhist philosophy that explains so much. In fact, Venerable Dundrup, who does the video, he's part of the video for Discovering Buddhism for the Karma module. He says, in his estimation, it's the most important teaching the Buddha gave. You can think there's a lot of teachings the Buddha gave that are pretty important and pretty valuable. But really, if we understand karma, we have the mechanism by which we can do whatever we wish. If you want to achieve liberation, well, you create the causes for it, and the causes are spelled out in the path. If you want to create enlightenment in your own continuum, well, the causes are all there. It's all cause and effect. We experience what we are doing, the causes that we create. Anyway, after that week of teachings on karma, my father and mother, I was talking to them on the phone, and my father was on at the time, and he says, "So what have you been doing with your weekend, Don?" And I said, "Well, I was at teachings on karma." And he says, "Karma? What's that all about?" And I explained it to him as best as I could, probably not as good as I even explained it here today, because I was still studying at that time, and I was fairly new to the concept. But after I explained it to him, my father goes, "Wow, I'm glad I don't believe in that." And I was like, I felt kind of bad because I was maybe planting some seeds for him not to be able to accept karma at some point in the future, maybe. But what can you say? I mean, for some people, when they hear these teachings, they think, "Oh my gosh, that's a pretty tall order for me to be kind of attending to everything to make sure that I'm keeping my karma as clean as possible, as virtuous as possible, and avoiding all the negative things." But for me, it's very liberating. And it's once more acknowledging that we're in the driver's seat. There's no one else driving the car. You're driving the car. I find that incredibly empowering. I find that liberating to know that, because when I grew up Catholic, it didn't make sense to me either that you have this omniscient, omnipotent God who is pulling the strings. At least that was my interpretation of it. Maybe that's not absolutely how it's taught in, a deeper philosophy, but it didn't make sense. Didn't give me, again, that ability to look at my own life and make decisions that were independent of that kind of concept. And karma is that. Karma says you will, yes, be the creator of your own future experiences, and you can change your future experiences by changing your mind and changing your behavior. So that fifth one, again, let's put it back on the screen. The idea here is that we inherit our actions, our karma. The results of those are acts of body, speech, and mind. These are what are called the three doors, the things we do verbally, physically, and mentally. These are what we have to experience the results of. They are our continuation in a sense, because as the mind goes through iteration from life to life, that is all karmically determined. And of course, karma is arising from our minds. It doesn't come from anywhere. And so the thoughts that we have inform that karma. And then, of course, the results are in the same nature of that. So this is really, again, a really crucial teaching. By the way, before we go too far on today, I want to mention for today and tomorrow, what I'm planning on doing, it's about 10:40 now, is that we'll take a little break because it's a 3-hour class and it's really, I don't want to teach 3 hours straight. And I'm sure you don't want to sit for 3 hours straight. So about an hour and 20 minutes in, we'll take about a 20-minute break and then we'll come back for another hour and 20 minutes, roughly. So that's how we're going to work today, just so you know. So let's go to the slide that and here I'm sharing from Larry Rosenberg. I mentioned that his text was the first one that I actually encountered these teachings in, again, called Living in the Light of Death. After he went through the 5 remembrances, he says, this isn't the cheeriest set of reflections in the world. And most people, when they first hear them, feel some resistance. We talked about that last night, how we have resistance to accepting the fact of death in particular. They don't mind contemplating the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence in the world around them, but this is getting a little close to home. You know, sometimes when we teach on impermanence or meditate on impermanence, you might think about the impermanence of all the things in our world and how everything is changing, but we have to bring it down to, and this applies to me. You know, my life is impermanent. That's why I experience aging. That's why I experience, illness. That's why I experience death. That's why I have the potential to, again, be separated from things at various times in my life, and particularly at death. And that's why I also am subject to my karma, is because it's all a process of change, everything changing all the time. I'm going to share here a little, well, actually, there's one more line, and then I want to share a little poem from Isa, the haiku poet. He says, what is being asked of us as meditators is to come face to face with the law of impermanence in an intimate way. As a story, before I share this poem, I might, some of you know of Isa, one of the great haiku poets of Japan. And he had a lot of death in his life. I think they lost their firstborn at birth, son that they had, and then their second child, I believe it was, their daughter, died at just over 1 year old. I think she died from something like smallpox or something. Really, very, very suddenly. Was quite ill. Seemed to get better, and then went downhill very quickly. And Isa wrote this haiku after that experience of losing his daughter to death. You may have seen this before. It's a really popular one in a sense, but it really expresses what grief and loss is about so much. The world of dew is the world of dew. And yet, they use this phrase dewdrop world sometimes in Zen Buddhism to refer to the transitory world, the impermanent world that we are involved in. And we can say, yeah, this impermanent transitory world is that, but, and yet there's that aching, that pain at having to deal with that reality. And to me, this poem really does get across the struggle that we all have with these teachings we're going through this weekend, is that a lot of it is to come to a place of hearing these facts, understanding these facts, just like the 5 remembrances are, and to getting it at that level. But there's still going to be some part of us that goes, well, and yet I still want my mother to be here. And yet Isa still wanted his daughter to be there. I mean, we still have that part of us that is still going to ache, that is still going to be in pain, at having to deal with the reality of loss, death, and so on. So don't think that, again, it's an easy thing to get to a place, and I don't think we ever want to get to a place of indifference. When that teacher I mentioned earlier said that, well, Buddhas don't grieve, I don't think that means that they're indifferent to loss. I think it means that they are actually quite compassionately involved in all the suffering of this world. And I think that is very much a part of our path all the way through to enlightenment, is to increase our capacity to have compassion for the reality that beings have to deal with, because all beings have these 5 things they are subject to. That is just the nature of their existence. So, it doesn't mean you become indifferent or kind of cold. You keep your heart open in regard to all of this. And that poem to me, again, kind of shows that tension to some degree. We can get the reality of it. It will hit home. We can do the death awareness meditation every day and apply that to ourselves and see it in others and what have you. But it's still going to be some sting there. There's still going to be some, and that's good that we have that, because that keeps us in touch with that compassionate motivation to be a benefit to others. Until we attain, again, some greater liberation from our own situation, we will have to experience those realities, those 5 things. But again, we're never going to close our self off to the reality of that for all beings. We always want to be compassionately responding to that. So that's a whole nother dimension of what we're looking at this weekend as well, is to make sure that we don't kind of form an indifference around these things. We can accept the facts, but there will still be that and yet, we still will feel the pain of having to have a world that is transitory in that way, where we have to experience death and so on. So Larry Rosenberg, in talking about it, says, death is a fact of existence, one that we all must face sometime. And death awareness is a real aid to practice. A deep understanding of mortality can often lead to awakening. Seeing that we don't have forever becomes a real motivating factor. This pulls us back once more to that idea that if we hold the awareness of death as best as we can, especially through the meditation we're going to do shortly, going to go move to that next. But even through the 5 remembrances, if we're able to hold that awareness, well, then we don't have forever. Then we will be using this life meaningfully. I sometimes use the example, it maybe is a way more mundane example, but if you were to go off to some wonderful place on vacation, I don't know, say you went to Paris or you went to Tokyo or you went to wherever, all these wonderful cities that, get a chance to see. If you went there and you just, decided you're going to just stay in your hotel room, until your trip is over, well, then that wouldn't be a very good use of all of that money to get there. You want to be able to take advantage of what those cities afford, right? So if you're sitting in your hotel room and just like watching TV and eating, ordering room service and what have you, and every day is going by, all of your, week or 2 weeks or whatever in this beautiful place, and you're getting closer and closer to when you have to get on your plane and leave. Well, what was the point of you going there in a sense? I mean, again, it's a very mundane example, but we would never think about doing that, right? We would never think about buying an expensive ticket and packing our bags and, going to some wonderful exotic place and then sitting in our room, right? You do. Maybe you need to do that, Casey. Maybe you don't get any time to just sit in your room at home. But I mean, I know, yeah, people work really hard. And sometimes when they go on vacation, they maybe need to sleep a day or two. And particularly if you've got jet lag from going to a place, maybe you need to do that for the first few days. But usually people are quite excited about taking advantage of what you have. Again, that entails acknowledging that the time is limited, right? So that you recognize, okay, I'm only going to be in Paris for a week, 2 weeks. Then I have to get my butt out and see the Louvre and see, all the wonderful sights, the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame. I don't know if Notre Dame's quite finished from all the renovation or whatever, all these beautiful places, right? You want to make sure that you take advantage of it. It's a mundane example, but it's kind of similar in regard to our human life. If we don't get that there's a fixed time that we are going to be on in this world, then we don't do what we're here to do, which once more, from a Buddhist perspective, is using this life to advance our spiritual development, to work on our minds, to develop deeper understanding of what the Buddha taught, to eliminate the negative tendencies, all these things that we can say are part of making good use of this human life. So again, I think that don't need to say too much more about that. There's a few more things coming up here that we'll get into as well. This is this whole thing of samvega and pasada. Again, I don't hear these Pali terms, and there's probably Sanskrit equivalents, but I thought I would share it because I think it's similar in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism, what we call renunciation. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But in Pali, this phenomenon of kind of recognizing the importance of using this life is known as samvega, the urgent need to practice that can grow out of a heightened sense of the perishable nature of life. It can include a real feeling of shock and a sense of not only that life doesn't last forever, but also that the way we have been living is wrong. Again, wrong is a pretty strong word. It's just misguided. It's not really using this life well. Going to Paris or all these other things, like I was talking about, the mundane examples are not the best use of this life. You can go to Paris, sure, but watch your mind. What are you doing with your mind while you're in Paris? Are you only getting more attachment and desire by being there, or are you actually using your mind well? Again, once more, the problem isn't the pleasure. The problem is what we're doing with our minds. But we have to be attentive to that, and we have to examine, well, how am I using my life? We call this the perfect human life or precious human rebirth, different terms we use for it. We really see the preciousness of having this existence. And I'm not going to go into all the teachings the Buddha gave on the various other forms of existence, but just look at our world. We can see that there are conscious beings who are in the animal realm in our lives, in our world. All these beings who are born with an animal body, which has an animal intellect, which is much less uh, usable than our human intellect. Our human intellect is quite astounding. And you can have people born as a human with some impairment to their intellect. So it's not to say that all humans have the same capacity, but generally, people who are born in a human life have an incredible capacity to use this life to investigate things, to understand things. And the Buddha gives amazing teachings that we can all understand. That's the one thing about Buddhism I also found very heartening when I came into teachings, and very different from my Catholic tradition, was that we're even encouraged to question the teachings, encouraged to doubt the teachings, to look at them in a very meticulous way so that we can come to understand their truth for ourselves. And if we can't, well, then maybe Buddhism isn't the path for us. But my experience is that if we examine the teachings, we actually do come up with things that we can have some conviction in. Karma is a little weird because karma is not something I can prove to you. It is, in a sense, a sort of theory, if you will, a Buddhist theory. Venerable Rabina treats it as like a hypothesis, but not just a hypothesis, a working hypothesis. She says if you live your life according to the principle of karma and do what you can, just see what results you get. You may not have immediate results because they don't teach instant karma. John Lennon liked instant karma, but I don't think it's really something in our world. Karma does take some time to ripen into results, but just see what happens to your mind as you're more meticulous in attending to your behavior, what you think, what you say, how you act in the world. Be very positive. So again, by doing these sorts of investigations into what the Buddha taught, we can gain great conviction in them. That's the blessing of this human life. So while you have this human life, how are you using it? Are you using it in, again, a misguided way to simply have all these, experiences on your bucket list or whatever that you have to get through? I have to see the Taj Mahal and I have to see this and I have to see that. Well, you know, the, again, I'm not putting down those experiences. They're fleeting transitory experiences, though. And are they going to matter in the end when you get to your deathbed in particular? You look back on this life and say, oh, I did all these wonderful things, but what do I have to show for it? Within the idea that what goes on, again, is our mind with all of these karmic imprints, all this information that's going to give rise to our future experiences. Have we created the proper causes for the results that we want? That's what this Samvega is all about. It's this being really encouraged to use our life well and to stop wasting this life. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he would talk about this frequently, about the ways in which we waste this life. And we're going to talk about some of those in a moment in terms of, again, it's not necessarily what you're doing, it's what you're doing with your mind while you're doing what you're doing. Every one of us has to work, create money, all these various things, and deal with children, parents, whatever, all of the stuff. But what are you doing with your mind in those situations? Okay, so this is something we'll talk a little bit more about. There's another little bit from Larry Rosenberg on Samvega, which I'm spending a little more time on because, again, this is not concepts I've seen in Tibetan Buddhism. So this Samvega, it might turn our world upside down, sending us off to a whole new way of life. Even if it doesn't have so dramatic an effect, it can light a fire under our practice. We get much less caught up in power, prestige, money, lust, the acquisition of goods. This idea of a fire under your practice, they often say you should practice like your hair is on fire, there's an immediacy to what you're doing because you have to attend to it. If you had your hair on fire, you would attend to it immediately. You wouldn't sit there and go, oh, just let it burn for a while. You'd want to get it out right away, right? Well, that's the immediacy we want to feel with our practice. So again, we might have different gradations of this, but as it says, we can often find that this helps us to lessen our involvement and attachment to all the things that we call kind of our pleasures of life. These things that we get quite preoccupied with. Now, again, whenever we're working with these teachings, it is important that we look at ourselves as the main topic to analyze. We're not going to become kind of critical of everyone else. Nonetheless, I do still think it's useful sometimes to see how preoccupied our world is with regard to some things, so that we then see it as a mirror reflecting back on ourselves. You know, the world that we live in, particularly this developed nation where they got so many things and goods and all of this, and what is the iPhone up to now? They just introduced another one, right? Like 17 or something, 16. I don't know what it is. I never got one, so I'm not sure where they are in the whole thing. You know, it went from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. I mean, it hasn't been around even that long, it seems. Now they're already in the teens and these iterations of, and they just keep like feeding the desire for more things, right? You know, get this, the new improved this, and you know, this that does this that didn't do before, and da 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 da, all the various things. And you can spend your whole life kind of preoccupied with particularly the acquisition of all these material possessions. It's kind of leading us into spend a little time talking about the 8 worldly concerns, which is a Buddhist view of what most people in the world are preoccupied with. And then we once more look at ourselves and see, and this is probably where I have some level of preoccupation with. We have to be honest with ourselves. I mean, Buddhism is not about deceiving ourselves, it's about taking a hard look at how we actually spend our lives and what it is that we do with our lives. These 8 worldly concerns are all of our preoccupations and attachment to having various things in our life and avoiding their opposites. That's essentially what we're talking about when we get into them. But once more, don't think that the things themselves are the problem. I mean, it is if we get a mind of attachment together with these and wants to keep furthering them. It really is still coming back to our minds. How are we relating to the things we have in our lives? So if you buy the iPhone 17 or whatever, fine, you buy this product, see it more honestly, see it for what it is. Understand that it's not the cause of your ultimate happiness. It's going to be maybe even cause of more suffering for you. Who knows, depending on how it works or what it does or whatever. Um, but see that, again, your attachment and your relationship to that object is going to be potentially the problem. That's the way that these are often presented, is to really recognize that having these things in our lives is not necessarily a problem, but your attachment and your distorted mind in relation to them is going to be problematic. Nonetheless, as I said earlier, some people do find it quite useful to simplify their lives, to not have quite so many material possessions, to live very austerely. If that is of your nature and you feel like you need that to support your practice, by all means, it's a wonderful thing to do. It's also good to some degree to be somewhat detached from just the craziness of having to acquire all that and needing to afford, you know, get the money to get all of these things and what have you. And then you've got just bills continually and becomes a really kind of rat race sort of life, right? Can see this in our world. We have to once more look at ourselves. Let me introduce you to these 8. They're in 4 pairs, all right? Let me first going to the little introduction from Geshe, or this is from Pabanka Rinpoche's text, but he's talking about Geshe Potawa. Geshe Potawa lived about 1,000 years ago. Amazing master of what are called the mind training teachings, the Lojong teachings. He said you cannot sew with a pronged 2-point needle. You can imagine a 2-point needle. How could you get anything sewn with it, right? Because it's got 2 prongs to it and 2 needles. If you do not think about death, you will not ignore this life. If you do not ignore this life, you will be influenced by what are called the 8 worldly concerns, or 8 worldly dharmas sometimes, but dharma there isn't the teaching of the Buddha, it's just the things, the phenomena that we get caught up in. So Geshe Potawa is saying something similar along the lines of this samvega, that if we don't think about death and don't have that kind of aha experience where we get to a point where we say, what have I been involved in? Well, then we never get free of these 8 worldly concerns. But the 8 worldly concerns can even act as a block to fully engaging in all this. So it kind of acts on both sides, can be blocking our thinking about death, but it also can be something that when we think about death, we recognize how much we have to contend with these. The 8 worldly concerns, the very first pair is what I was just talking about, craving for material possessions. This is the kind of what we see as the positive side of it. We get totally caught up in this. Many people in our world, and perhaps ourselves to some degree, might still have some things we need to address there around acquiring things, but material possessions. You know, and you might need certain things, you know, have some possessions, but you know, do we really need all the things that we have? Look at all the garage sales, yard sales that happen. I mean, people trying to get rid of stuff that they've acquired that they recognize that they don't really need. Then, of course, you go there and you buy more stuff that you don't really need. And the companion to this is craving to be free from a lack of material possessions, to not suffer that lack or loss of them. Certainly when it comes to like greater losses, as I was mentioned, like losing your home in a fire or something, that could be quite disastrous for people, right? Where do you suddenly have nothing that you had possessed before. But just recognizing that these are all things that we are going to have to be parted from, as we saw in that one remembrance, well, then why do we have such attachment to them? And why do we get so bent out of shape when something disappears or something breaks or whatever the case might be? These two are kind of the same mind of craving, in a sense, wanting things to go our way, wanting to get the things that we want, wanting to avoid losing those things. Contentment can be something we can have in spite of whatever it is that we have. And this is what the kind of antidote, in a sense, to this craving for material possessions or, not to lose them is all about, being content with whatever you have. There's a wonderful story about a meditator who didn't have very many possessions. In Tibet, these meditators would go up and find a cave and they would live there with very, very few things. And it said that, this is, I think, a more modern day thing where somebody had given this meditator a watch or something, and he didn't really need a watch, but he would leave it there on his altar. He went down to procure some food and stuff so that he could continue meditating. And when he came back, somebody had stolen the watch. And he was really elated. He was like, "Oh, good, that's gone now." Someone else has it. I don't have to worry about it. It's out of my cave. So again, what is our attitude? If you were to come home after this teaching, say you go home and you found that you'd been burgled, someone had come in and stolen some possessions of yours, what would your initial thought be? Would it be, "Oh, good, I don't have that to worry about anymore." Maybe, but might also be, "Oh my gosh, what happened? I need that. I want that," depending upon what they took. So this pair is very much a part of our world in the you know, 21st century here in a developed country like America, where you have just a plethora of stuff that you can spend your money on. Amazon and all these places with a zillion products. I don't even know how many products they have now. It must be about a zillion or something, right? Because you can't even find what you're looking for half the time. But anyway, all of this is just indicative of the world that we live in. This is one of our fundamental worldly concerns. We just get really preoccupied with that. And if you've liberated yourself from that, I congratulate you. We all do need certain things. We need to have clothes on our body, we need to have food on our table, all of that. It's not denying that we need some level of material stuff in our lives to be comfortable or to have some measure of a kind of a platform from which to um, engage in life. But to what degree have we gone to excess? And then what attachment do we have to those so that we would just be really horrified to lose those things? You can even do a little meditation. Sit in your home and just reflect on, well, what would it be like to not have these things in my life? Look around. You can also maybe be grateful that you have them. There's nothing wrong with gratitude, but it's also really good to examine, well, what would it be like to be without those things? That can be a measure of our attachment to some degree. And I don't want to spend too much time on these, but I feel like they're an overlooked teaching. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would teach on them frequently. He even has a whole book called How to Practice Dharma that's all about these 8 worldly concerns. If they interest you, you can read it. It can be quite shocking. But the second pair is the really tough one, 3 and 4. Craving for happiness and comfort, craving to be free from unhappiness and discomfort. Now, happiness is kind of elusive. When you say, well, we're talking about having pleasurable experiences and things that are comfortable for us. We really are. This is Venerable Rabina told me once, this is the hardest one for her in particular. And I think it's hard for a lot of us. We like being comfortable, right? We want it, like it to be sort of soft and warm and fuzzy and everything that is in that nature for us so that we have a good experience throughout our day. We want if we get a beverage, we want it to be at the right temperature. And if we get food, we want it to be, the right way, fixed the right way, the way we like it and what have you. I call this kind of our inner Goldilocks. Remember Goldilocks and the Three Bears? She went in their home and she's like, "Oh no, this one's too hard, and the bed is too hard. This bed is too soft. Oh, I want something that's exactly what I want, right in the middle or whatever." We have that kind of guiding us, always wanting to have the most comfortable experience. Even when you gather like a group, like we're here, maybe there's some people here would go, "God, it's really cold in here." And other people might say, "Oh, it's really hot in here. I wish they'd turn the air conditioning on." You have that kind of mixed experience, right? And so every one of us has something that we tune into that is what brings us happiness, pleasure, comfort. And that's what we kind of feel we need throughout our day. If you're asked to eat something that is different, that is not what you usually eat, or that you don't like so much or whatever, then it's a big hardship, right? That's the other side of it. We feel kind of bent out of shape if we have to deal with discomfort of any degree. Um, I sometimes find it really useful. I usually fly Southwest because it's just so much cheaper than the other airlines, but it's kind of a pain because, you have to get on like 24 hours in advance and get your little slot in the boarding groups and whatever. And it's interesting sometimes, like I'll be teaching or something at the time when my flight's going to leave the next day. So I'm not going to be on my computer getting my seat or whatever, my assignment. And so I end up getting the aisle seats, right? Nobody reserves an aisle seat for themselves. You might reserve it on another airline, for yourself and someone who's sitting in the seat next to you by the window or the aisle. But it's kind of an uncomfortable seat, right? Every one of you's flown in an aisle or in a, what did I say? I mean the middle seat. I'm sorry. I said aisle. I meant middle seat. Okay. Now I no, I was getting looks from people and I was like, I must have said something wrong. Sorry. Okay, nobody reserves a middle seat unless you're flying with somebody who's sitting in the aisle or the window next to you, right? Okay. So it's useful sometimes to do that. Like say, okay, I'll be the one that takes the aisle seat. And you have to do that on Southwest sometimes just because you're boarding too late, to be able to get a nice seat. But that's just a small example of what we deal with that we call discomfort, right? It's not that long. Even if, I mean, Southwest doesn't fly that far. They fly some international flights, but you're not going to be on the plane that long. It's a few hours of your life, and it's a discomfort. Well, again, it's just an indicator for us of how much resistance we have to something that we find uncomfortable. And I don't want to make too much of this, but I think this is really a pair that we have to examine because if we're living our lives continually attached to things always being our way, well, then we do see how much the mind reacts when we don't get our way, when we have to deal with situations that are not ideal because they're not exactly how we like them. I suppose some of this is a product of the world that we do live in this developed nation where we have so many ways of controlling all of that. And we think that that is how we have a good day, is if we control everything so that it's all exactly the way we want it to, with the music playing that we like and everything else being, exactly what we want, staying with the people that we enjoy and all of this, that it's somehow a good life then. That's not necessarily so. I mean, look at all these great figures in our time, like Mother Teresa, who went through an incredible amount of discomfort, I'm sure, to serve the people of, it was Calcutta then. It's Mumbai now, isn't it? Yes, no, Calcutta, Kolkata. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Bombay is Mumbai. Yeah, I don't know India so well. I'm learning. So anyway, she's dedicated her life to working with people who were disadvantaged, and making sure that she was attending to them day in and day out. I mean, that's not a comfortable place to be, right? And most people really kind of excel when they get outside of their comfort zone, when they actually deal with that discomfort. Just putting that in there, one friend of mine said that he found he only grows when he's outside of his comfort zone. So if we look at this and how much comfort kind of keeps us in this delusion too of like everything being okay. Because if everything from the time we get up till the time we go to bed is the way we want it to be, well, then we don't take any issue with things. So this one, it's not only that this one's hard to kind of work with, it's hard to even kind of see that it's very disadvantageous to be in that state where we are totally convinced that if as long as we keep getting what is comfortable, life is good. Once more, that bumper sticker. Life is good. Occasionally we have to deal with illness or whatever, or some problems, but generally life is good. So why would I even then take any interest in doing anything differently? And that's what Samvega once more is alerting us to. Take a look at our lives and how we're living our lives. And maybe we're a bit misguided. Let's carry on. Otherwise, again, we're going to be spending too much time on these. But the next pair, actually, these last two pairs, they're kind of related in a sense, but one has the general way that people are looking at us in a larger context, which is reputation. And then the other one is how people, individuals, see us and have opinions about us in regard to who we are or what we do on that much more one-on-one sort of basis. So craving for a good reputation craving to be free from a bad one. This drives people to some degree. Lama Zopa Rinpoche thinks this is actually something that is there in most of us, that we really want people to think well of us. In fact, Venerable Robina, she called me a people pleaser once. And I think I have that tendency sometimes of just wanting people to be happy and please them and whatever. I don't think there's anything wrong in wanting people to be happy and to be, but you have to look at once more, what's your motivation? Is it you want people to think good of you? You really want people to say, "Oh, that Don, he's a swell guy," whatever. Or do you really care about other people? I think that's the delineation here. There's nothing wrong with wanting to do things for other people, so that they will have some thoughts of you being a good person. But if you're doing it for that reason, so that you've got a good reputation and other people, admire you and what have you, that's all just, once more, a worldly concern. It's just inflating our pride and so on. So this pair, I think we have to, again, examine our own lives and see to what degree are we preoccupied with reputation and wanting to avoid people thinking poorly of us. Now, there are situations where maybe it is important that because of the role that we play, that if there's a bad reputation about us that's forming, that's on the basis of wrong information, that we try to address it, because that's not healthy either. But at the same time, try to not have it be all about you. It's all about the community, for example, or other people then having some confidence in you so that you can continue doing what you're doing. Sometimes bad reputations do come about without anything really being there. That is the possibility. So anyway, I'm just pointing that out, that there is maybe some need sometimes to attend to these things, but it doesn't mean that we have the same mind of grasping and attachment and craving that we're talking about. The last pair, which was just on the screen there, had to do with praise and criticism. Again, praise and criticism are when individuals are saying good things about us, and we love to hear that, right? Oh, you're so good. You're so wonderful. I think you're fantastic. And then the criticism, you didn't do such a great job. You really kind of sucked at that or whatever. We we get that sometimes, right? And we don't like to hear the criticism. In fact, they have that saying that if you have 10 people and 9 of them say something really good about you, but that one person says something negative, well, then you hone in on that person and you think, oh, there must be something wrong with them or something going on, and maybe even get into a whole debate with them because we're obsessed with people being critical of us. We have to learn to be much easier on that and recognize criticism as part of a human life. Again, we're going to receive criticism. We're going to receive praise. But to what degree do we get inflated and attached to that and really need that? So again, I could say more on all of these, I'm sure, but it's really just to make us aware that when Larry Rosenberg was talking in that quote about Samvega, where we start questioning then, well, what am I doing with my life? The 8 worldly concerns are a good gauge of to what degree are we preoccupied with things that are really not that consequential, not that substantial. Yes, it is nice to have a comfortable life, to have the things that you want, to, receive praise, to have a good reputation. All those things can be very advantageous. But to what degree are you attached to them? Well, you can often see it by to what degree would you suffer if you lost them? And that's good indicator of the amount of attachment. If you were really going to, test it, you could see what it would be like to be without it. And chances are a lot of us will find that we have a great attachment to having those things. So this is one way to examine this idea of what it is that we're doing with this life. And some of you, once more, may be free from some of these, and I think that's great. If you've already addressed these in your own life and don't really have these issues, well, again, I prostrate to you. So then Larry Rosenberg goes on to say in regard, he says, Dharma teachings start to make real sense to us, or whatever spiritual teachings, they really do resonate with us when we are addressing this and having this kind of level of samvega, this interest in using this life well. We begin to live the Dharma teachings instead of just assenting intellectually. Samvega leads to a conversion of the heart from an egocentric existence to a search for that which is timeless, vast, and sacred. Now, again, I said in Tibetan Buddhism, we often talk about the word renunciation, which I don't think is a direct equivalent to the samvega. There's an element of it. Renunciation, when we use that term, we're often talking about this idea of wishing to emerge. In fact, the Tibetan for it, ngenjong, means to definitely emerge. The idea is that we want to emerge from this unsatisfactory situation that we find ourselves in, that we see that this is the foundation for everything the Buddha taught, to want to be free of the causes of our own dissatisfaction and suffering. And of course, eventually to want to help others to do that as well. So renunciation is kind of related to it, but I think Samvega has a different flavor to it as well, because it's once more this heightened sense of really feeling like we need to do something meaningful. We need to do something purposeful with this life. I think it's there with renunciation, but it has, again, a slightly different flavor. So that's the nearest concept I can see in terms of the way that some of you who are more indoctrinated in the Tibetan Buddhist view, we get away from that, our own stuff, what we want to do with this life, how I please me through the things I acquire and what have you, and search for something that is much, much more vast, something that is something we can put all of our confidence in, such as these deeper results of liberation and enlightenment. Now, this other word, pasada. I'm again pronouncing these as best as I can. I never studied Sanskrit, so I'm probably, obliterating them. But an important accompaniment to Samvega is the Pali concept of pasada, which might be translated as clear and serene confidence, a conviction that our situation isn't hopeless, that the practice of meditation and other spiritual practices, can take us beyond these, experiences of sickness, aging, and death. So this is kind of, once more, an element we see to some degree in renunciation, but in the Pali, it's really divided out as a separate thing. It's not just the Samvega that sees that we need to kind of change things in our lives in a very drastic way. It's also the confidence that we can do this and actually be free from all of that. Of course, and that involves, in Buddhist terms, to develop a deeper understanding of the Four Noble Truths. The way that the Buddha set out what our situation is, that we are experiencing a unsatisfactory existence, what we call samsara, that the causes of that are within our own minds, our delusions, and the karma that we've created that keep us going from existence to existence, as we talked about earlier today. And then the last two truths being that we can have an end to all of that. I mean, I always joke that if the Buddha had only taught the first two truths, if he said, "Oh, guess what? Life isn't so great, and you're the cause of it," and said, "Good luck with that. I hope it works out for you," and just kind of disappeared, we'd be like, "Oh my gosh, what did you just wake us up to? You woke us up to this horrible fact of our existence, but you didn't give us any way out." Well, the Buddha gave a way out. Buddha said, yes, in the third noble truth, you can be liberated from all that. You can have a cessation of that. And the path that leads to it, the fourth noble truth. Gave us all the teachings that we could follow in order to actualize that. Well, how wonderful, Then it's not only a doctor telling us we have an illness and that, we've created the causes through whatever we're doing, but it's also saying you can be cured and here's the medicine, right? That's a good doctor. That's why the Buddha is said to be the best doctor, because he's giving us the full picture, not, holding anything back. So this confidence that we're talking about here, this pasada, is when we see that, yes, I can attain that. I know that that's possible because we've investigated the Buddha's teachings and we've come to see that there is a way out, that the exit door is there and it exists, and we just have to follow the path to get us out of there. So this is, again, a very important concept that is a part of renunciation. But again, renunciation has a slightly different flavor. We'll finish this off and then we'll do our little break. The problem surrounding these phenomena is not external to us. It has everything to do with our cravings and attachments. Suffering is not a dead end, but a gateway to realization, because it's actually kind of utilizing what we have in this life as the basis upon which we can generate deeper understanding realizations. Then the next part here, the proper application of the practice of the Eightfold Path, which again is a way that they approach the teachings very much in the Pali tradition, can turn the pain of sickness and death into the joy of liberation. Now, the Eightfold Path, we don't really teach on that quite as much in Tibetan Buddhism, but all the elements of it are involved. In fact, they say that the Eightfold Path could be broken down into three main trainings. Through the training, higher training in morality, which is where everything really starts, a foundation of understanding that we have to be meticulous in attending to our actions of our body and our speech. That's right action and right speech. And then even attending to our livelihood, right livelihood. Those are three of the Eightfold Path. They constitute the branch of morality. Morality is the foundation of everything the Buddha taught. If you aren't attending to your karma and your actions of body, speech, and mind and what you're doing with your life, well, then don't have a good platform upon which to develop the other two trainings. The second of the three higher trainings is concentration. Concentration depends upon right effort, right mindfulness, and right, concentration, meditative stabilization. Those three are the main factors that contribute to developing a very focused mind. Because at this level of kind of concentration or that type of state of mind, we're talking about the ability to stay single-pointedly focused on objects, to be able to investigate them. This is a skill that you acquire through your meditative practice. So if you have the mindfulness that doesn't forget the object, the effort that puts enthusiastic energy into doing that practice, and then the concentration you develop on the basis of that, those three, well, then you have correct concentration. So that's the second of the three higher trainings and three more of the Eightfold Path. So you have the three of the morality, the three of concentration. You have two more that are involved in the higher training in wisdom, which is what we want to eventually get to. The Buddha said that fundamentally, the wisdom that we need to develop that will be the main factor that releases us from samsara and helps us to attain the peace of nirvana or enlightenment. But again, you need the foundation of good concentration to do that, and you need the foundation of good morality to develop that concentration. So all three trainings are needed. The two factors of the Eightfold Path that pertain to that are right understanding and right intention. So we have to have a right understanding, knowing the Buddha's teachings, and especially how to develop that deeper wisdom. And we have to have the right intention, motivation for engaging in that, and so on. So all 8 of the Eightfold Path are incorporated into the way that we approach it generally through the three higher trainings or the other practices that we engage in on the Bodhisattva path in Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. But essentially, this is once more what the whole purpose of this pasada is, to kind of get us to a place where we have that level of conviction in these teachings and we apply the teachings that we've received in terms of these three higher trainings or Eightfold Path or whatever approach we want to use to talk about this, to go from the unenlightened and non-liberated state into the joy of liberation, the joy of enlightenment, to turn the pain of sickness and death into that. So this is, again, something the Buddha taught, something that we all can practice. That ends this little topic on Samvega and Pasada. We'll take questions when we come back. Went a little bit over my 20 minutes after, so it's about 23 minutes after or so. So somewhere around 43, 45, somewhere in there. I'm not going to get too specific on the minutes. Plan to be back here by 11:45 California time. Okay. All right. Take a little break. I'll see you soon.